Hi everyone, welcome to the ATTN podcast. This is the intro, so unfortunately it's just me, but I think this is a really important thing for us to do in order to give you a good overview and a good context behind why we're doing this podcast. So I'm Danny, the ITDG founder, and I will be predominantly the host. So why are we doing this podcast? Well, I have a lot of really good conversations with people in relation to mental health and well-being, overcoming adversity, tough times, etc. And often I come away from that thinking, well, that was great conversation, but we're the only people that got value from it. So the aim behind this is to really spread that value out amongst others from some really interesting people. A really good friend of mine, who is a very, very intelligent person as well, had an excellent way of explaining how he perceives podcasts and why podcasts are good for people. And I just wanted to share that with you all. So what he said is even though you're not part of the conversation, maybe this might not strictly be scientific, by the way, but again, I think it's a good explanation. So even though you're not strictly part of the conversation, your brain might not really know the difference. So you still feel a part of that conversation. And that's why, again, I feel like this medium is really going to be beneficial moving forward to try and change the conversation around mental health and well-being and really dig into the weeds. We're going to be exploring different questions throughout this medium. One of the key questions is going to be, what can you tell us about the most difficult time you've had mentally? Now, this could be poor mental health. This could also be some sort of challenge, adversity, etc. Because not everybody has experienced poor mental health, and my aim isn't to try and create a narrative that is the case. But we are going to be exploring those conversations. And something I am going to be doing is I'm going to be asking people more in depth about that as well. So we're not just going to be glossing over, talking about a time in the past when I had difficulties, etc. We're going to dig into that a little bit. I have had conversations with professionals, psychiatrists, etc., and they assure me that the way in which it's going to be done is going to be safe for the guests mentally. Sometimes this might bring up trauma. Again, we're not aiming to focus on the trauma. We're going to be aiming to discuss what it felt like when things were most challenging. So that's a really important thing to take away before we start listening to the episodes. Something that's really important relating to this podcast is I'm going to be asking people to be vulnerable. So I feel like it's my duty, it's the right thing to do for me to be vulnerable also. I feel like I have experienced poor mental health most of my adult life, and that forms part of why I do what I do. I like to try and keep my experiences as neutral as possible, as in if I'm talking about my experience, I kind of refer to it as stuff as opposed to a struggle. Now, don't get me wrong, there's probably times where things have been a struggle, have been difficult, but it is really important to me personally to classify them in a more neutral manner, which then means I live with these things, not in spite of these things. So yes, I might experience poor mental health on a daily basis, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end, but it is something that I live with and not as opposed to takes over my life. So a little bit more about me. Obviously, that's a general bit of context. I served in the military for 14 years, or just under, I should say. During that time, I was a Royal Engineer. I was a plant operator, really terrible one at that. So as a result, I used to try and avoid doing that as much as physically possible. Naturally, that kind of got me into some interesting situations. So when I went to Afghanistan, I looked for IEDs. So in essence, roadside bombs are sometimes referred to as improvised explosive devices. In essence, the job was with a metal detector me and another gang of idiots, because I'm not calling my teammates idiots, but it's a pretty strange job to actually do, where you're walking around with a metal detector looking for things that could, but hopefully would not, go bang. So I think one thing I always like to point out as well, for me personally, even though I did experience some pretty wild things during that tour, that isn't why I would say personally I feel the way I do and experience things the way I do. However, the more I've aged and the more I think about it, there are things that do make sense as to why I feel the way I do, in terms of, if you're going to be looking at ground for 6 months at a time, and everywhere you look you think, could there be something underneath this? Naturally there might be a connection to what I'm going to say next in terms of the stuff I do experience. So for me, my stuff, I often worry about my health, and I'm talking to seriously neurotic levels. Generally it doesn't, outwardly you might not notice this, but for me it's something that when I am experiencing that, I'm quite obsessive over it. And as I say, it might be internally or externally. I'm quite good at verbally explaining how I feel, but sometimes inevitably my mind will run a bit wild. Also, I experience bouts of depression. As I say, I have had real low points within my life also. I feel like the conscious aspect of this topic really only came to me when I attended a mental health first aid training course about 7 years ago. And as a result, I sat and I was thinking, I experienced that, I experienced that, I experienced that. And that was when we were talking about different conditions and whatnot. Now, I'm not saying self-diagnosis or anything like that, but these are things that I do experience. And like I say, it is on a daily basis. So why do I do what I do? Well, actually, I feel like there's a lot out there that is rubbish, shall we say, that we could improve on, we could make more better outcomes for. And I do feel like it's an important task, because generationally we have to take ownership of what people are going to do next, etc., and try to influence that change. And that's partly where it is for me. Again, I'd be more than happy to talk about my story in more detail, but I feel like it would be a lot better served doing that on a podcast, as in what the story of when things became most conscious or when things were most difficult, because that's how this format will work. But I did want to give an overall insight to you all about how I feel and what I experience. Anyway, that's the intro. That is the explanation. I don't want to go on much longer, because I know people will want to be hearing about guests and whatever else. And as I say, there will be more to come in the future. But that's the overview, and really excited to get this started and get going. So really, thanks for your time, and look forward to episode 1, which is Steve-O.